As you can see, we've got no Kate, we've got no Tom, and well, we've got a Tom lurking, so I have a horrible feeling it might be Tom keeping an eye on us, but officially, and no Stefan. So we're in the experienced hands of Amy and myself, Richard Foster. I'm one of the steering group for the network, and at one time was chair, and it's lovely to see you all here this morning. This is the 99th call, the 99th conversation. So we're just on the cusp of a 100th event, and I'll be able to tell you who will be speaking next week at the end of this session. But well done to everybody. There's a lot of people who are here who have been at most of those calls, those 99 events. And I suppose with the world as it is at the moment, with so much division, it still feels valuable. It may be a different crisis, but it still feels important to be in even a digital room together. That's where understanding and consideration comes from. So I think it's very tangential, but it feels like a positive act, us all being here this morning. So well done for you all being here. I'm delighted we have two great speakers, Max Newsom, who is going to speak to us about his filmmaking. He's a filmmaker and writer. And we're also going to hear from Leah Varnell, who is the managing director of Words by the Water, which is kicking off very shortly. So she's going to tell us a bit about what's going on. So before we hear from them, can I just ask Amy, is there anybody new who's wants to say hello? Have you spotted anybody that you don't recognize?
That is a good question, and I don't think I'm as good as this as Kate. We've got nobody admitting to being new in the chat, and I can't see anybody waving desperately. Obviously, we'll hear from our contributors in a moment. So no, cool. I don't think we do. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. Obviously, as everybody knows, the meeting's recorded, popped onto our website. We've got transcription if anybody needs it as well. And just if everybody could just pop themselves on mute if you're not speaking, and if you need to ask a question, you can pop your digital hand up and then remember to pop yourself off mute. But yeah, that's it. I'll hand over to Richard now.
Brilliant. So it's great. We're all old friends from previous visits, so that's great to know. So I'm going to hand over to Max now. Max is a filmmaker who has his roots in Cumbria, was born at Askham and educated in Penrith, and spends a lot of time up here in Cumbria. In fact, he's going to tell us about something he'll be doing here in the county tomorrow, and then tell us a bit more about his filmmaking career and work and projects in hand. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Max. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as you say, it's wonderful to be talking in a time of crisis. It seems that history is all about lurching from one crisis to another. And I think, you know, the arts are one of the few things that keep going and make sense of it sometimes. Thank you for referencing the talk I shall be giving tomorrow, which is at the Keswick Museum at 3 o'clock. And as part of their exhibition, they have about a family growing up in the Keswick area in the 1920s. And I was made aware of this when I was doing a Q&A for my latest film, which is called Iceland is Best, for which we had a screening at the Alhambra in Keswick with Carol. She very kindly said, well, perhaps you would like to talk a little about cinema and other occasions to us. And the opportunity came to talk about cinema in the 1920s, and particularly, in fact, Coco Chanel, because one of the family members in the exhibition was typical of quite a lot of young women in the 1920s, in as much as she grew up into a decade that was startlingly open to new opportunities for women. When I have a great aunt who was one of the first women to fly a biplane, for example, from that era. And it's a time of sort of glamour when you think about the Ritz or the Savoy or London hotels or hotels in Paris and New York. But actually, for pretty much everybody who lived, certainly in an urban context, the 1920s were really exciting. And it's an opportunity for me just to talk a bit about that and how cinema went hand in hand with opening up the world to people. And I would say, in fact, I think the 1920s were more radical, more seminal, and more formative than the 1960s. I think that there were newer opportunities of a grander kind than had ever, been presented to humanity before. And it exploded. And when you think that it happened between the First World War and Spanish influenza at one end, and then being bookended by the Great Crash in 1929, it's all the more remarkable. It's barely 10 years in which the world changed beyond recognition. So anyway, that talk is going to be just about 45 minutes at Keswick Museum tomorrow. And I think that one has to book, it's free. It's in a socially distanced space. And then later on in the evening, I think about 7 o'clock, there are going to be 2 films screened at the Alhambra, one of which is going to be Midnight in Paris, which is the Woody Allen, frothy movie, which is fun. And then one film chosen by the young programmers at Keswick, who are a group of young people who are connected to the Alhambra cinema, and they help with programming, marketing, and so on and so forth. And Carol is to be commended, along with her co-owner, for promoting this initiative. And they have chosen to watch Nosferatu, which is a classic horror film of the period. I think it's 1920, 1922. And I've watched it twice and I still had nightmares. I can't even think about it. And I don't think I'm going to be in the cinema to watch it. I should be trembling somewhere behind the ice cream concession. But I might allude to it in the chat, but I think it's a remarkable film. So that's Keswick. Perhaps it might be an opportunity, if we're ready, just to show the trailer for my film set in Iceland. And I can then just chat a little bit for a few minutes about how I came to make it, why it is connected with Cumbria. And well, anyway, we can, we'll see.
Great, no problem. I'll play that out for you now.
Thank you.
When I wake up in the morning, the first thing I want to feel is the light. Come to say goodbye.
Sika is going to California.
You can be a poet here, in this village. You can buy a house next to ours and you can speak Californian there.
It's okay to tear down what's been a wall.
We are Sika's guardian angels.
You have me stay with these 2?
Can I get a lift?
You were going the other way.
No, I'm going your way.
I've been dreaming all my life in the dark, but I want to live in the light where it's warm.
There's magic here. From poetry to this.
From this to poetry.
I think I'm in love with an idiot. Do we know this idiot?
Unfortunately, yes.
So you can't drink and fly.
Your man will be flying, I will be drinking in the back.
Why is this so hard?
It's too early.
When is the right time for a feeling?
Is the canoe looking for anything?
Just friends.
This is what it feels like.
Sometimes you don't know where the journey ends.
You'll be just fine.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. So that's a film called Iceland is Best, and it strangely grew out of my growing up in Cumbria, in fact. I became aware of it when I was working as what is called a head of development of a fairly large film fund in Los Angeles in 2005 and 6. And it's a dreadful place to work if you have a soul. I mean, I think that LA is gloriously open to filmmaking, but of a very particular kind. And it's very hard to smuggle in films which come from the heart or the soul, because everything sort of goes through a mangle and comes out pre-processed, cut into what we would now call tropes and almost visual memes, which are supposed to correspond to marketable concepts by the marketing department. And it's a dreadful back to front way of making films. Anyway, I happened to be in a video store renting videos of an international kind, and you were allowed to take out about 15. And I noticed that there were a really interesting shaped pair of eyes watching me, making my choices from behind the counter. And I went across with my stack and said, so where are you from? because she had a look that was very unusual. And she said, I'm from Iceland. And you could have knocked me over with a feather. I'd never met anybody from Iceland. And I didn't even really exactly know where it was on the map. You know, if I'd been in one of those games, it'd been like a blind man's buff. I'd have hit the North Sea in about 15 places and still missed Iceland. But my family name is actually a Danish Viking name. And we know pretty much that, because it's in the Doomsday Book, that we arrived in Yorkshire, then came to live in Lancashire, then ultimately ended up in Ireland, but have never drifted very far from Viking origins. And I think there might have been a part of me that was always curious, at least at a subconscious level, to find out a bit about that heritage and certainly the Nordic countries. And I've always been very interested in them and had colleagues who were Swedish, but I'd never been to any of the Nordic countries at all, other than Sweden, for short periods of time and to do research on various projects. So I said to the woman who was talking to me, who was called Siri, could I interview her about her life? And she said, well, yeah, if you think it's interesting. And she told me her story, which is essentially she left home at 17, told her parents one day she was going to leave, and set off to go to the airport to fly to California, where she wanted to become an actress and an artist. And I thought this was a lovely universal story about how someone might just announce something improbable to their parents and friends and then just leave, or try to leave. What's interesting is it took her 3 years to get to the airport. What's even more interesting is the airport is 1.5 kilometers from her front door. And it's the story of why it took so long to get there that was so moving and fascinating. And essentially, she fell in love with someone who tried to stop her from going, as people sometimes do. And so it became a story about how your dreams are obstructed by the good intentions of other people. And her friends didn't want her to go, and her family absolutely didn't want her to go. So for me, on many levels, this was an interesting story. And where this related to me was that I grew up in Cumbria for much of my life. And before then, I did in fact live in Derbyshire and in the south of England as well. But I was in Cumbria for quite a lot of my adolescence. And certainly when I was at school, the last few years, it was at Penrith Grammar School. And for me, the Cumbrian Fells were both a resource, a place where you went to dream, but also a sort of prison in a way. I used to stare at the Pennines and wonder what lay the other side. And I had this overwhelming desire just to walk with nothing more than what was in my pockets and just keep walking and see where it took me. And on that level, it's very much like a Greek myth, someone heading off into the unknown, surrounded by clashing rocks and dragons. And the story of Siri in Iceland was precisely that. So I was always very moved by her story, and we decided early on to shoot it on film stock, which is obviously the analog traditional way of making films, on big cameras, which they no longer make anymore, on very beautiful lenses. And what they don't tell you when they're talking about the digital revolution in filmmaking is that it's actually the lens which is the most important thing of all. And it's one of those curious sorts of quirks of the modern world as they try and write out of the script some of the most important things just because it's commercially unappealing. Because the people who are trying to sell you television sets and digital technology don't make lenses. Surprise, surprise. Anyway, film stock for me is the most beautiful medium still. It also imposes a rhythm of work. It incites or inspires rather, a sort of reverence in your filmmaking family. The cast like it, they have to work harder, and the crew like it. And in the good old days of filmmaking, when there were very few filters through which you had to pass to make your film, people very often would be very acutely aware that you have only a limited period of time in which to make your film, and that you must do it quickly, and that you have to nevertheless make it up as you go along. So it's almost like a band playing to a live 8-track tape recorder in the studio. Theoretically, you've got lots of time, but actually, you've probably only got 3 or 4 takes to get it right. And I think the glorious thing about filmmaking in the conventional way is that it inspires you to try very hard to get it all right. The film is being distributed at the moment. We know that we're going to have it digitally released in April, early April. We're still waiting for confirmation of the final date, but it will be April, and it will be available on DVD. It'll be available for streaming. You know, it'll be ultimately, it might even appear on television. So we'll see. And it's obviously because of COVID, which has changed the world of filmmaking enormously, and the way that people consume films, and the way people think about films, and of course it's greatly impacted people's cinema habits. It has had a sort of powerful effect upon our film. The normal thing for a film like ours would be to go to film festivals, and we got accepted by various film festivals, and excitingly in America, which is obviously a very big market, but couldn't attend any of them because of COVID. So you're always struggling from that point onwards to make an impact. But one of the things I've learned and very much enjoyed doing was realizing that in Cumbria, there was a ready media interest in the film because it was tangentially related to Cumbria, because I come from Cumbria, and it was, you know, part of my experience of growing up became important for the film. So I was able to talk to Cumbria Life and the Cumberland and Westmoreland Herald, the Keswick Reporter, and Radio Carlisle, Radio Cumbria as well, all took a strong interest. And it was great to be able to talk from that platform, or those platforms, and especially talk about why being Cumbrian or growing up here has been so important to me. Because in London, you know, people in a way don't really care where you come from, and that's great, but they also really don't care where you come from, and which is less great. And you can forget some of the things that are really important to you. And I've always travelled backwards and forwards in Cumbria and London, have known how important it is to me, but I don't often get asked to talk about it. And it would prove to be a great opportunity to do that. And so that sort of led me to think that it might be a good idea to make another film, or make my next film, based in the Northwest, for example, which is a place I know well. And it so happened I had a project called Rocket Man, which is based in Morecambe in Lancashire. And it's about 3 or 4 friends who end up building a facsimile of Apollo 11 moon rocket for one of their daughter's school project. And the town gets rather carried away and rather assumes they're building a real rocket. And so with very limited resources, they have to sort of look as though they are, and end up making a spaceman suit out of a Michelin Man tire suit, and have a sort of fish tank bowl headpiece and a snorkel. And they wander around with a Kellogg's cornflakes packet painted white on their back. And the pensioners think it's real. And so they actually have a sort of liftoff day, which goes gloriously wrong, as much the rocket actually travels a few meters into the sea and then rolls out the famous Morecambe Tide with our hero trapped inside the leaky rocket. And around this is a love story with people unable to tell various other people that they love them and one another whilst this is unfolding in the background. And it's a sort of very British film. You know, there is some whimsy there, but it's also quite lyrically about growing up in unpromising places. You know, this isn't Malibu, it isn't New York, it isn't Long Island, it isn't Paris. You know, it's a rundown seaside resort in Cumbria that frankly looks a bit like Sarajevo, 2 blocks behind the seafront. And I've always been very drawn to very British places to tell stories, and this is just one of those. So we're hoping this year, 2022, to start to build some interest in that project and try and get interest from perhaps the Liverpool Film Office, but also from any kind of Cumbrian help I can get to promote the film, talk about it. And it's obviously an opportunity in due course to employ local filmmakers, whether they be crew or cast, to take part in the movie. And I'd love to be able to do that. I was saying earlier on, just before this segment began, that my filmmaking career almost began with Nell and I, which I hope is the film you're all familiar with. And my brother was asked to be the stand-in for Richard E. Grant. So they set up all the lights around him. And there's quite a story attached to that, which is a little too long to tell here, but I did visit the set and it completely blew my mind as a 19 or 20-year-old that actually, how old was I? I was 23, that this thing could happen in Cumbria, because then there was very little glamorous filmmaking of this kind at all. And I've always, in a way, wanted to pay back, as it were, for that excitement. And I'd love to do a film about two guys setting out from Carlisle, let us say, to go and try and live in London. Or even just to go there for a weekend at a particular time in their life. And it would be very much based upon my experience of hitching down to London, to and from, with the kind of equivalent disasters. And I think it could be quite a lovely film to do. And just for personal reasons, I very much enjoy it. I'll just say one other thing about filmmaking is that it's important to have lots of different projects alive in your mind at one stage. And because I write my own material for the time being, although I also like collaborating, especially on comedy, you do end up having half a dozen projects which you carry around almost like trays in an oven, and you pull them out. And on each one is a partially baked cake. I have another project set in the northeast of England, in Northumbria, where my dad lived until he died, near Alnwick. Actually, he was in Alnwick. And I'd love to use northern landscapes in filmmaking as much as possible. And I'm aware that the world audience, even the British audience, is mostly aware of southern English landscapes. So they like fields of wheat and sort of waving big deciduous trees. And actually trying to sell people a film which is set with harder shadows and mountain edges and things like that is harder. So I would very much like to be able to pull that off at some stage. So I think, just as by way of a conclusion, that any sort of quorum I can sort of build in a way amongst people who are interested in film or interested in helping develop film awareness or storytelling, or bring in young people who want to be in film, because this is a wonderful time, actually, if you're a craftsperson, to go into cinema and TV. There's never been more demand. There are 6,000 too few craftspeople in the industry at the moment, and that figure will rise to 40,000 by the end of the decade. And it's all because of the television revolution. And for the most part, the employment is in the south, but it's very well paid and gives people an opportunity to learn about filmmaking. And I'd very much like people to take advantage of that, you know, coming from places like Cumbria, where those kind of opportunities are less talked about. And certainly they weren't when I was growing up. If there's time, I'd just like to say a little bit about the future of independent filmmaking as well. Because obviously it's an international business, and internationally we've all been hit by COVID. And I don't know how many of you are aware of how basically films are classically, traditionally made. Originally used to have studios who owned the cinemas, they owned distribution, and they signed to themselves contracts with the film stars. So they owned everything from the top to the bottom. It's called vertical integration. Then there was an antitrust law which came along and said, you can't do this. And then Olivia de Havilland sued the studio and said, you cannot restrict my right to work for other studios. And so actors floated free. And studios lost their grip over the whole machine of filmmaking. And the people who came in to that equation were agents. And in the 80s and 90s and noughties, the agents ruled Hollywood and ruled filmmaking. And if your star was famous, you could see in the box office that Bruce Willis made your film more successful, or Schwarzenegger made your film more successful. So they started ramping up the prices, and there began a very rapid escalation of inflationary costs in filmmaking. And so you went from relatively affordable middle-range films to hugely expensive films of the kind that can sink studios but make enormous sums at the box office. And as the noughties became the early teens, as it were, they discovered that they could make more money by selling perfumes and endorsing brands and merchandising than they could actually for movies. So then movie stars became a whole part of a bigger industrial, commercial, corporate image building, selling, right selling combination. And what's happened in COVID is that no one's gone to the cinema, practically no one. So there are no figures anymore which tell you how successful an actor is. So there's no reason why you would buy an actor as expensively as the agents want to sell them to you. And so it's a possibility, it's no more than that, that we have possibly seen the end of the star system as we know it. And this will mean that with television, there's much more demand for what they call content. And so people will have to take chances on actors. And it will mean that agents will have less clout and their actors will be less expensive. And what this all means is, when we come back to Cumbria and producer, director, writers like me, is it may be possible to start to make films again, which are stories driven by stories rather than by stars. And, you know, Varnell and I included 2 actors who were virtually unknown, but it was a defining movie for them. And I think the best movie of the last 25 years, you know, of the 20th century and into the next probably 10 years of the 21st century in British filmmaking. And it would have been tragic if someone had said, you can't make this film because you don't have a star in it. You know, we would not have had Paul McGann. We would not have had Richard E. Grant. We wouldn't have had the famous speech about holding on to a balloon until you have to let go of it by the man smoking the big carrot weed cigar in the bath. You know, all these things we'd have been deprived of. So I think it's possible in the modern era, with television and the demise to some extent of the cinema as we know it, that we're going to go back in time when the field is going to be more open. Cinemas will be made more like restaurants. They'll be more like shops because Disney will buy them, Netflix will buy them, and they'll all try and peddle their own stuff. And it will be like the old days in the 1920s and 30s where the main producers of films owned everything. And that will be stifling in its own ways, but for the short term, it will present opportunities. So I'm hoping that people will start to go back to the cinema, that they will start to watch, you know, stories that aren't just star-driven. And however good, you know, Matthew McConaughey is, or however good, you know, the cast of Friends are, it might be nice to see other people having a go at telling the stories. So, you know, COVID has been worse than the Second World War. Not even the Nazis closed the cinemas. But this is what happened to us. And, you know, I lost a couple of projects and it became financially very difficult for a long time. And it still is to a certain extent. But what drives me, and I think independent filmmakers, is that fundamentally we're artists. And an artist doesn't stop just because the going gets tough. You know, and in fact, it throws you back onto yourself and your first principles and makes you decide what it really is important to do with your life. And as Richard was saying, you know, at times of crisis like this war, you obviously a part of your mind is with the people of the Ukraine, but it also makes you think about, well, what, you know, will I do if there is a bigger war, you know, and what do I think will be important and what has been important in my life? And I don't think I'll ever lose the unshakable belief that telling stories about humanity is the most important thing that a filmmaker can do. So I don't plan to give up that anytime soon. And, you know, I'm proud to have spent part of my life in Cumbria and to keep coming back to it and keep finding inspiration in the hills and the light here. And I acknowledge that my audience doesn't live here on the whole, but I'm thrilled, you know, to have had the association with the Alhambra and indeed with Reged Cinema, who were very receptive for my film as well. And look forward to bringing the films of the future back here and, you know, trying to draw people into filmmaking so that Cumbria can become connected to the wider filmmaking universe and perhaps more closely connected than it has been in the past. So yes, I think that's, and thank you very much for the opportunity for me to talk about that. So that's sort of what I had in mind to say at this stage.
Thanks, Max. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Really interesting and inspiring. There's an opportunity for a little bit of Q&A now. So if you have a question, raise your digital hand. I'm going to use my privilege and just ask the first question, which I think is taking that whole thing about young people and your inspiration in Cumbria and the opportunities you had. And it's something that the network is keen to support, is the opportunities for young people in the county. But there's also that issue about, do you need to get out of county to truly learn or seek new inspiration? And in a sense, that's kind of what you have done, is live this kind of schizophrenic life, partly in Cumbria and partly in London. Do you think you would ever flip and base yourself in Cumbria? Is that possible? Is it necessary? And what has that bigger implications for young people in Cumbria? Do they always need to go away and hopefully come back? Because we have this endless brain drain and an aging population. And how do we reverse that so that people like you, maybe even earlier in your career, return to the county?
I think that's a very good question. I did know a filmmaker who made the last feature film I was aware of with Janet Sussman just before she died. And he used to work in Great Salkeld, and he rented a room, had a lodging there. And it was very tenuous, and I was very struck that you could have this international life, but be doing it via a phone. And this is pre-mobile phones from a small place in Cumbria. And I became aware that this is possible. And I think with the internet, with, as you say, Zoom, Skype, to a certain extent with cheap air travel, you can be very connected with people. I don't think, if you were talking to someone in LA and they said, where are you talking from? And you said Cumbria, they probably have no idea where you are. If you say the Lake District, they probably have some idea. And it's not an impediment. For a long time, if you said you lived in Cumbria to someone working in London, not only did they not know where you came from, but they had an active prejudice against it because it was outside the M25 and therefore irrelevant. Well, there's been a big move, and the British Film Institute is trying to promote film awareness. And, I'm aware of grants that are available. In fact, I'm trying to apply for one so that I can talk about independent cinema to the people in the Keswick area. But it's very much, there's an historical problem here, is that, there are a few cinemas. And certainly during COVID, apparently young people have stopped going to the cinemas altogether. And what Carol says is most people who go to cinema are over the age of 40, and almost nobody under the age of 20 goes at all anymore. They spend their time looking at their phone, terrified they're going to miss something. So it's, the problem exists on many layers. The young people have been intimidated and terrified by the propaganda surrounding COVID, and they are genuinely frightened of the outside world. And when I was showing Iceland is Best, I went and spoke to about 250 kids in Penrith and Cumbria at different schools. And they very often sat in stunned silence that someone from outside the building had come in to talk to them, still less. And the head of the sixth form said, I said, well, was that a total failure? And he said, no, that's the best talk we've ever had. But they really have stopped connecting with the outside world because of COVID. So I think there's a local problem here that we have to get over. However, Americans are building studios in the South, and there's nothing to stop someone going off, learning a trade, earning very good money, because people working in those environments earn between £1,500 and £3,500 a week. And you can work 12 months round in the year. The demand is so great. And you could come back, and then you could apply to, say, the BFI or, one of the TV broadcasters based in the North with an interest in the North, and say, look, I have a story or an idea of a story, and I'd like to make it here. I'm going to try and find out myself whether that would work for the project set in Morecambe, or, the one maybe set in Carlisle, going into London and hitchhiking. But making films is never easy. It has always been to do with money and where the money is. But I would like to think, just in the same way as if you look at the example of craft food making in Cumbria has become a very big thing in the last 30 years. And now you can buy fantastic cheese, you can buy fantastic, meat, and it's beautifully packaged and it's artisanal and it's craft-based by lots of relatively young people who've either moved here or who've stayed here. And I think it's a sort of model for the rest of society, is that as people realize that, you know, cities are expensive and quite ugly places to live, that it's actually possible to be based somewhere else. And, you know, with a little bit of help, with grants and so on and so forth, you know, it doesn't, for a writer, you know, a grant of £4,000 or £5,000 might make all the difference in Cumbria. You know, might get them the opportunity to write a first draft, you know, or attend a course or two and then write a first draft, something like that. So you have to provide some seed capital, I think, and some structures in which people can start to see there's a way to get from Ascot or Cockermouth or, you know, Maryport into a bigger pool. And I genuinely believe that those avenues exist, but they haven't been quite established yet in the minds of people and as practical things. So I do hope that as the years will roll on, that people will be able to be based up here, you know, based in Cumbria in the Northwest, and be making films. And even be connected with Americans. And maybe one day the Americans will build a studio in the North because there is so much pressure on space in the South. And it may be that they'll build one in Liverpool or Manchester. And that is entirely possible. So I'm hopeful that there can be development. And I would like to think that, you know, for a version of me in 10 years' time or 5 years' time, you know, you could come back here and you could have a family in the North, you know, living on the kind of rather tenuous supply of money that there is in filmmaking, and still continue to do it and mature as a filmmaker and as an artist. So yes, but I think there could be more support and a little bit more awareness of the benefits that filmmaking and program making can have, because of course the money it brings in can be startling to a local community if someone comes and spends £1 million or £2 million or £5 million on a film production. An awful lot of that will stick to the local context, and also it leaves a kind of glamour, and it brings in tourism, you know, and it has a powerful impact, you know, on the community for years afterwards.
Okay, we've got a minute to go. We've got one more hand. Amy's patiently held her hand up for a little while. Do you want to ask your question, Amy?
Yeah, sure. I think we could chat to you all day. It's such an interesting person. So we kind of want to make sure we leave enough room for our second speaker. But yeah, I was quite interested in the film stock that you mentioned. Yeah. Is it, I mean, you know, I occasionally kind of try and source just, you know, camera film, sort of 35mm camera film, which is getting more and more expensive and difficult to find. So is there a limited supply of the film stock? Does it make the project a lot more expensive? And again, sorry, because we don't have much time to answer that, but yeah.
Exactly. There was a time when producers said, oh, it's much more expensive. And on the whole, producers haven't made films and they just say what they think is fashionable or what they're under pressure to say. And actually shooting film on film stock can be cheaper. You shoot less of it, you grade it less expensively afterwards. And basically what you see through the viewfinder is what you get on the screen. It's also very beautiful. And, you know, a few years ago, when we first started researching this project, 2016-17, 7 out of the films nominated for Best Cinematography at the Oscars were all shot on film stock, you know, even at that recent time and late on. So I think that film stock is wonderful, but there are huge pressures to try and marginalize it. I'm going to keep going on it for as long as I possibly can. I may have to shoot a film digitally, but whenever I have the choice or can make it happen, I will, even if it means paying myself or other people less, because it's just more rewarding, I think.
Great, thank you.
Max, thanks so much for spending time with us this morning. The two takeaways I've got is to watch the film Iceland is Best. Look out next month when it's released in one shape or form or other. Yeah. And actually that comparison between the food industry here in Cumbria and other creative industries, what are the learnings we could have from that? Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting idea and a concept that I think we could explore in the network. What can we learn from that industry and how prominent it's becoming and how much it's established as a kind of a marker for the county, and how could we learn from that? So thank you for that. It's really helpful. I know you've got to dart away to another meeting in a little while.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having had me, and thank you for the questions too.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Now we're going to hand over to Leah, who's the Managing Director of Words by the Water, which is pretty imminently arriving here in the county. Amazing programme, and she's going to just tell us a bit more about the goodies that are on offer this year. So over to you, Leah.
Thank you, Richard. I just wanted to talk briefly about the past, the present, and perhaps a little bit about the future and about the development of the festival in the region, really.
Brilliant.
So we're 21 this year, so we've come of age, which is quite exciting. The festival was started 21 years ago by Kay Dunbar and Steve Bristow, who are a couple. And they first started in Devon 30 years ago. So we're celebrating our 30th this year in Devon as well. So it's a big festival year this year. And I'm on as managing director, kind of sorting out all the festivals, and we do 3 a year. So we do Devon in July, Cumbria in March, and Southwold in Suffolk in November. So it keeps me off the streets. It's a busy time. But yeah, we're delighted to have been in Cumbria for 21 years. We have enjoyed during most of that time, and my history is a little hazy because I've only been with the company 8 years. But I think Melvyn Bragg has been the president through most of that time, if not all of that time. And this year we're really delighted that Mary Elsa Bragg, his daughter, has agreed to be a co-president. I almost called her deputy then, and that would be wrong, a co-president, and taking over some of her dad's kind of responsibilities in the festival. As you say, it's starting on Tuesday next week, so I'm ridiculously busy, and if the phone rings I apologize, or if my email pings I apologize, but yeah, this is the apex of where my job is terrible, because it's the busiest 2 weeks. But I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you so much for welcoming me. Yeah, so we've been going for 21 years. COVID obviously hit us really hard, like all other arts organisations. You know, we've been really badly affected, and actually COVID was coming down the track in March 2020 when we were in Theatre by the Lake in Keswick. And as we drove up from Devon, where we're based, we were kind of mildly joking about what was happening, and then had no idea that we'd end up closing the festival early. And things escalated so fast in those 10 days. And we haven't been back to Cumbria for 2 years now, effectively. So I'm absolutely chuffed to bits that we're coming back and that we're putting on a festival, and that it's 6 days long. It starts on Tuesday next week, not next week, the week after next. And yeah, we've got 60 odd writers and speakers coming to the festival. It's a kind of half-size festival. We'd normally be twice that many, but we've put in place kind of COVID safety measures alongside the theatre to make sure that there aren't too many people kind of too fast going through the building. What is the festival? So the festival, Kay and Steve, the other two directors, always kind of rap me over the knuckles when I call it a literary festival. And quite rightly, but it's a good shorthand for what we do. It's a festival of words and ideas, because we don't ever want people to think that it's literary and you need to be of a literary mind to go to it. And the push forward all the time is to try and make the festival more accessible, democratic, egalitarian, diverse, all that kind of stuff. So there is a preconception in most communities that I work in, Cumbria, South Suffolk and Devon, that you've got to be kind of brainy to go to a literary festival, and you don't, is the answer. And my job really, my direction really is to try and make sure that people feel welcomed at all stages. And we've got people that have come. We've got people that have come for all 30 years to all 3 festivals. So actually, you should probably have them on talking about my job, because they probably know more about the festival than I actually do. And certainly in Cumbria, people have taken timeshares out in the area and booked their timeshares in accordance with the festival date. So and will come to buy a festival whole ticket, you know, for the whole period of the festival. And it is their holidays, you know, this is why they're coming to Cumbria in March. So I think, and I hope we bring quite a lot to Cumbria. And yeah, I think people come to the festival, but they also go out and eat in pubs, restaurants. They buy well, maybe not an ice cream in Cumbria in March. That's a bit of brave soul that does that, isn't it? But they're out in the bookshops, they're out in the community, and with the sensitivity that I'm not Cumbrian, and we're not based in Cumbria, we have an advisory group who meet kind of 3 or 4 times a year, but particularly coming into a festival, I lean on them greatly. And Sue Allen, thankfully, is one of those, and Mary was one of those people, to take the temperature of the region and who is up and coming, what talents are in the area, and to really guide my hand about how the programming goes, because we really want to bring a regional sensitivity to, I know who's writing in Devon. I don't know who's writing in Suffolk or in Cumbria necessarily. So we have an advisory group of I think it's about 8 members that meet intermittently and will advise me. And they're quite full-throated in their advice sometimes about what I'm doing with the festival, but they're very helpful to bring the festival together and make it kind of a real celebration of Cumbrian talent and up-and-coming writers and so forth. And I have to mention Bookends and Bookcase, both who are absolutely instrumental in guiding my hand and supply the books for the festival, but also to Steve for programming a whole day. So I give over a whole day of curating the festival to Steve Matthews. And he brings in his local writers, and Gwenda this year has curated the On Our Doorstep Day for me, which has been brilliant because they have their finger on the local pulse. And long may that continue. And their events are selling incredibly well. So yeah, I take my hat off to both of them for the writers that they've brought to the table for the festival this year. We normally, as I say, have 120 events and would expect anywhere between 12 and 16,000 people through the doors at Words by the Water in Theatre by the Lake. This year it's shorter and smaller, as I said, so it's not going to be as big. And we're fighting our way back out of a really, really difficult time. We haven't put on any of the 3 festivals over the last 2 years. We kind of did a mini Dartington, but it was very mini. So I'm actually really excited about the festival that's coming up. And there's a few highlights. Shall I run through a few highlights? I was asked if I wanted a PowerPoint, and then I just thought it's going to look like a rogues gallery of those pictures when people go to prison, and they have to stand with and it would just be writer after writer with their publicity shot. And I thought, well, actually, no, I'll just talk. You can imagine what the people look like. You know what Vince Cable looks like, right? So you don't need.
We've got about 3 minutes. Give us some juicy highlights to whet our appetite. It'd be great to hear.
Okay, so we've got, well, I'm quite excited that we've got quite a lot of political people, which, given the situation in Ukraine at the moment, is really important. We've got Luke Harding, who is a massive specialist in Russian culture and is actually in Ukraine at the moment. So the likelihood is he's going to have to zoom into the theatre rather than be in the theatre, but we're going to cross that bridge in a week or so. We've got Gavin Barwell, who is Theresa May's Chief of Staff. We've got David Owen, who's also talking about Russia and the West. We've got Justin Webb, who's talking about from Radio 4, who's doing his memoir. I'm really rattling through it now, aren't I? Basically, I don't want to go on and on about who's coming particularly, because this isn't a pitch like that. Is my feeling. I mean, if you want to know who's on the programme, go to our website and I can give you, Richard, the address to send out to people if they want to. There's like I say, 60 writers.
We've posted that on chat so people can dip in and go to the website.
What I do want to briefly talk about is the future of the festival rather than the present of the festival. And what I really want to do, and I'll do this in 2 minutes, Richard, I promise, is to get more young people engaged with the festival. So if anyone has got links to schools, universities, a place where we can engage people to come and do work experience, taking photographs or filming or interviewing or writing book reviews, that would be really rather marvellous. And also, we've always had a bursary scheme, which gives a free festival-long ticket to young people up to the age of 24. And that hasn't been taken up in Cumbria in a way that it has in Devon. And I'd be really interested if any of you have got any thoughts on why that's happening and how I can try and engage more young people in the festival. And just to flag up with everyone, I mean, I really do mean it when, you know, the future is with the young and it is about education. We have standby tickets for under 24-year-olds. So if you've got any under 24-year-olds in your life, if they phone up the box office at the theatre, instead of paying £12.50, they can get a standby ticket for £8 to get into the festival for much less money. So yeah, the future is more important than the present or the past, really. And I would welcome any kind of thoughts on how to make the festival more accessible, how to make it more young friendly. And yeah, please all buy tickets and tell all your mates about it, because we're desperately seeking to survive at the moment after this terrible pandemic. That was really brief, wasn't it? I rattled through that, sorry.
No, it was brilliant. The energy
I was
came
watching
away.
the clock.
Thank you. That's really fantastic. Leah, could you put your email address or how we could contact you to start those conversations about engaging young people? Because it is, of course, what the network wants to do. So it'd be great if you could let people start that conversation with you.
That'd be brilliant.
Otherwise, well done. Thank you for coming back. It's every time somebody says this is the first time since the pandemic, it seems like another victory. So well done for coming back to Cumbria. It's great that you were going to be with us, and we'll all come and see events over that next few days, should I say. Brilliant. Thank you. Brilliant. So we're nearly finished. We've just got Amy just to give us a little bit of an update on opportunities, and then we'll wrap up at past, as we always do.
Yeah, we're getting there. We're not doing too bad. We're just about on time this morning. Just as well, Leah, there's you can save the chat. There's just an interesting comment by Andrew, just wondering about the demographic of the authors, and I'm wondering if that maybe is something to do with engagement with young people as well. You know, maybe young authors would get young people involved. Yeah, but anyway, that's not what I'm supposed to be talking about. I'm just going to share my screen because I'd just like to flag up the website. Just bear with me. Yeah, so it's just to flag up that there are lots and lots of opportunities on the Cumbria Arts and Culture Network website. And by opportunities, there's quite a wide range within that. So we've got jobs on there, there's a trustee opportunity at the top there. Artist commission opportunities pop up. So we've got sort of more conventional jobs, freelance opportunities as well. As I say, sort of, we've got some traineeships here. And yeah, so it's basically just to flag up that this facility is here. There's absolutely loads of them there at the minute. And it's also just to kind of flag up for you guys, if you are working in, you know, anywhere that has some opportunities to flag up, whether it's a job, whether it's an artist commission, a call out, also sort of artist training opportunities we'd be really interested in sharing as well. So yeah, it's a resource, we'd like to use it. And if you guys know of any opportunities at all, just pop us an email to hello@cscn.co.uk. And yeah, if you know sort of, you know, anybody that's looking for opportunities, particularly sort of younger people, that kind of thing, send them to the website. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks. Yes, an amazing resource, the website. It's always worth checking back in on it. It's got so much information on there now, and it's building every month. So please keep using it and referring back to it. So we're slightly ahead of time, but hey, that's not a bad thing. We've all got busy lives. So just to say thank you to our speakers, to Max and to Leah for today's presentations. Next week is our 100th anniversary conversation, and the speaker will be Stuart Marconi, who many of you will know spends much of his time in Cumbria now, and he'll be here speaking to us. So it'd be great if you could be there to see him. There's lots of stuff in chat for you to have a look at before you disappear. And thank you so much for being here today. I hope you have a great weekend and take care. So thank you for all being with us, and Amy for keeping me on the straight and narrow. Thanks very much.